On May 1536, the air at the Tower of London hung heavy with dread, the ancient stone walls echoing with the whispers of betrayal and doom. A woman, once the most powerful queen in England, stood poised on the scaffold, her dark eyes scanning the small crowd of onlookers, a faint, enigmatic smile curling her lips just moments before the executioner's sword would sever her head from her body. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, met her tragic end not with tears or pleas, but with a quiet, almost defiant serenity that has puzzled historians for centuries. What secret did she carry to her grave? What could possibly inspire a smile in the face of such a brutal and public death? To understand the mystery of that final smile, we must journey back to the glittering, treacherous world of the Tudor court, a place where ambition and love were as dangerous as any battlefield. In the early 16th century, England was a kingdom on the edge of transformation, ruled by a young, charismatic, and increasingly volatile King Henry VIII. Henry had inherited a stable throne from his father, Henry VII, but his reign would soon be defined by his desperate quest for a male heir and his growing obsession with power and divine right. The court was a labyrinth of intrigue, where nobles, clergy, and foreign ambassadors vied for influence, and where a single misstep could mean disgrace or death. It was into this cauldron of ambition that Anne Boleyn, a woman of sharp wit and unyielding determination, stepped, forever altering the course of English history. Anne was not born to be a queen. Born around 1501, though the exact date remains uncertain, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a rising diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a woman of noble lineage. Her early years were spent in relative obscurity compared to the grandeur she would later know, but Anne's education and exposure to the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France shaped her into a woman of remarkable intellect and charm. She learned the art of conversation, music, and dance, but more importantly, she absorbed the political savvy and cultural refinement of the French court under Queen Claude. When she returned to England in 1522, she was no longer just a nobleman's daughter. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose beauty, though not conventional with her dark hair and olive skin, captivated, and whose mind intrigued even more. It wasn't long before Anne caught the eye of King Henry VIII himself. By the mid-1520s, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his first wife and a Spanish princess, was crumbling under the weight of disappointment. Catherine, though deeply pious and beloved by the people, had failed to produce a surviving male heir, and Henry, obsessed with securing his dynasty, began to question the validity of their union. He believed their marriage was cursed, citing a biblical passage that warned against marrying a brother's widow. Catherine had briefly been wed to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before his untimely death. Into this storm of royal discontent stepped Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to Catherine, whose sharp tongue and bold demeanor stood in stark contrast to the queen's quiet dignity. Henry was smitten, drawn not just to Anne's allure but to her refusal to be merely a mistress. Unlike her sister Mary, who had briefly been Henry's lover, Anne played a longer game, insisting on marriage or nothing at all. This audacious demand set in motion a seismic shift in England's history. Henry's pursuit of Anne became intertwined with his desire for an annulment from Catherine, a process that would drag on for years and pit him against the Pope and the Catholic Church. Anne, for her part, navigated this dangerous terrain with a mix of cunning and genuine affection for Henry, though some historians argue her heart was always more aligned with power than love. As the king's obsession grew, so did the enmity of those who saw Anne as an upstart, a schemer who threatened the stability of the realm. Catherine's supporters, powerful nobles, and even members of Anne's own family whispered against her, planting the seeds of resentment that would one day bear deadly fruit. But in those early years, as Henry fought to make her his queen, Anne seemed untouchable, a woman destined to rise to unimaginable heights. Yet the path to the crown was fraught with peril. The annulment process, known as the King's Great Matter, dragged on, testing Henry's patience and Anne's resolve. By 1533, after nearly 7 years of waiting, Anne was pregnant, and Henry, unwilling to risk the child being born out of wedlock, secretly married her in a clandestine ceremony. The Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine led Henry to break with Rome entirely, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, a move that reshaped the religious and political landscape of the nation. Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony, but the public's reception was cold. Many still saw Catherine as the true queen, and Anne as little more than a usurper. Her triumph was tainted by whispers of illegitimacy and the heavy burden of expectation. She needed to produce a male heir to secure her position. The stage was set for a drama of Shakespearean proportions. Anne Boleyn, now Queen of England, stood at the pinnacle of power, but her enemies circled like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness. Her relationship with Henry, once fueled by passion, began to show cracks under the weight of political pressure and personal disappointment. The birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1533, rather than the hoped-for son, was a blow, though Henry initially masked his frustration. Subsequent miscarriages only deepened the king's disillusionment, and Anne's sharp temper and outspoken nature, once so alluring, began to grate on him. Meanwhile, at court, new players emerged, including the quiet, demure Jane Seymour, who caught Henry's wandering eye. The very qualities that had elevated Anne, her ambition, her intellect, her refusal to bend now, made her a target in a game she could not afford to lose. As we delve deeper into this tale of love, power, and betrayal, we'll uncover how Anne's rise became the prelude to her catastrophic fall. The smile she wore on the scaffold was not born in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of struggle, heartbreak, and perhaps a final act of defiance against a world that sought to destroy her. But to understand that moment, we must first explore the mounting tensions and betrayals that turned a queen into a condemned woman. As Anne Boleyn settled into her role as Queen of England in 1533, the crown on her head felt more like a target than a triumph. Her coronation, though a spectacle of Tudor opulence with golden canopies and cheering crowds orchestrated by Henry's command, could not mask the undercurrent of hostility that pulsed through the kingdom. Many of the common folk and much of the nobility still revered Catherine of Aragon, viewing Anne as an interloper who had bewitched their king and torn apart the sacred bonds of marriage and faith. The break with Rome, a seismic shift driven by Henry's desire for Anne, had fractured England's religious identity, leaving Catholics resentful and reformers wary. Anne, caught in the eye of this storm, found herself not just a queen but a symbol of division, a lightning rod for every grievance against Henry's increasingly autocratic rule. At court, the atmosphere was no less treacherous. Anne's sharp wit and assertive nature, once the very traits that had captivated Henry, now sowed seeds of discord among those who surrounded her. She was not content to be a silent consort. She engaged in political discussions, championed religious reform, and wielded influence over appointments and policies, often clashing with powerful figures like Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Cromwell, a man of ruthless pragmatism, had initially supported Anne's rise as a means to push through the break with Rome, but their alliance was fragile, built on mutual benefit rather than trust. Anne's outspokenness also alienated other nobles, who saw her as overreaching her station, a mere knight's daughter playing at being a queen. Even her own family, once her staunchest allies, began to distance themselves as her position grew precarious. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and her father, Thomas Boleyn, were more concerned with preserving their own status than defending her honor. The greatest threat, however, lay closer to home in the heart of the king himself. Henry VIII, though still enamored with Anne in the early years of their marriage, was a man driven by obsession and impatience. His longing for a male heir bordered on mania, a need rooted not just in dynastic ambition but in his own fragile ego. The birth of Princess Elizabeth in September 1533, while a moment of joy for Anne, was a bitter disappointment for Henry. He had expected a son, a prince to secure the Tudor line, and though he put on a brave face, the cracks in their relationship began to show. Anne's subsequent pregnancies ended in heartbreak miscarriages and stillbirths that eroded Henry's confidence in her and fueled his growing frustration. Each loss was a blow not just to Anne's health but to her standing, as whispers spread that perhaps God himself disapproved of this union, echoing the very curse Henry had once attributed to his marriage with Catherine. As Henry's affection waned, the court became a breeding ground for intrigue and betrayal. Anne's enemies, sensing her vulnerability, began to circle. Among them was Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale young woman who served as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Jane was the antithesis of Annemiek, where Anne was bold, submissive where Anne was defiant, and her demure charm caught Henry's eye by 1535. Unlike Anne, who had once held Henry at arm's length until marriage was assured, Jane played the game of courtly love with a calculated innocence, allowing Henry to cast himself as her protector. Rumors of the king's infatuation with Jane spread like wildfire, reaching Anne's ears and stoking her jealousy and fear. She confronted Henry, her temper flaring, but such outbursts only pushed him further away, reinforcing his perception of her as a shrew rather than a supportive consort. The very passion that had once bound them now became a wedge, driving Henry into the arms of a woman who promised peace and, perhaps, the son he so desperately craved. Beyond the personal, political machinations tightened the noose around Anne's neck. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally in the Reformation of the English Church, began to see her as a liability. Anne's support for religious reform leaned toward the evangelical, favoring figures who sought a more radical break from Catholic traditions, while Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, sought a more moderate path to consolidate power for Henry. Their disagreements over policy, including the dissolution of the monasteries and the distribution of their wealth, created a rift that Cromwell was quick to exploit when he sensed the king's favor shifting. Cromwell, a master of political survival, understood that aligning himself with Jane Seymour and her faction could secure his own future, even if it meant orchestrating the downfall of the queen he had helped crown. He began to gather evidence, fabricate Anne's supposed misdeeds, whispering to Henry of her sharp tongue, her arrogance, and most dangerously, her fidelity. Anne's own behavior, though often born of frustration rather than malice, did little to help her cause. Her flirtations with courtiers, a common practice in the game of courtly love, were misinterpreted or deliberately twisted by her enemies as evidence of infidelity. Her close relationships with men like her brother, George Boleyn, and musicians like Mark Smeaton, while likely innocent, provided fertile ground for scandal in a court obsessed with appearances. Anne's pride, her refusal to bow to those who scorned her, only deepened the resentment. She was a woman who had risen too high, too fast, and in the eyes of many, she needed to be brought low. The tension at court reached a fever pitch by early 1536, as Henry's dalliance with Jane became more overt, and Anne's latest pregnancy ended in another tragic miscarriage in January of that year, a stillborn son that some said broke Henry's heart and sealed Anne's fate. The walls were closing in. Anne, once the most powerful woman in England, found herself increasingly isolated, her allies dwindling as her enemies grew bolder. The king, disillusioned and eager for a fresh start, began to listen to the whispers of betrayal that Cromwell and others fed him. What had begun as a love story for the ages was now a tragedy in the making, with Anne at the center of a web of envy, ambition, and deceit. The stage was set for a fall so swift and brutal that it would shock even the hardened courtiers of the Tudor world. But how did it come to this? How did a queen who had once held Henry's heart in her hands become the target of such vicious intrigue? By the spring of 1536, the once unassailable Anne Boleyn found herself teetering on the edge of ruin, her position as Queen of England crumbling beneath the weight of betrayal and royal caprice. The miscarriage of a son in January of that year had been a devastating blow, not just to her body but to her standing with Henry VIII. The king, who had once defied the Pope and reshaped a nation for her love, now looked upon her with cold disappointment, his words cutting deeper than any sword. According to contemporary accounts, Henry remarked bitterly after the loss that he saw God would not give him a son by her, a statement that echoed through the court as a death knell for their marriage. Anne, still recovering from the physical and emotional toll, could sense the shift in the chilling realization that her greatest protector had become her greatest threat. Henry's growing infatuation with Jane Seymour only deepened Anne's isolation. Jane, with her pale complexion and quiet demeanor, was everything Anne was not, and Henry, ever susceptible to the allure of novelty, began to openly court her. He showered Jane with gifts and attention, even as Anne remained queen in name, a public humiliation that stung more than any private slight. Courtiers, sensing the wind change, flocked to Jane's side, eager to align themselves with the rising star. Anne's once loyal ladies-in-waiting whispered behind her back, and even her own family, including her ambitious father and uncle, began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their own necks for a queen who seemed doomed. The court, a place where loyalty was as fleeting as a summer breeze, turned its back on Anne, leaving her to face the gathering storm alone. The true architect of Anne's downfall, however, was not Jane, but Thomas Cromwell, Henry's cunning chief minister. Cromwell, who had once championed Anne's rise to secure the break with Rome, now saw her as an obstacle to his own power and to the king's new desires. Their disagreements over religious reform and the spoils of the dissolved monasteries had already strained their alliance, but it was Henry's waning affection that gave Cromwell the opportunity he needed. He understood that, to secure his position and, perhaps, his life, he needed to remove Anne and pave the way for Jane Seymour. With ruthless precision, Cromwell began to weave a web of accusations against the Queen, exploiting the court's penchant for gossip and Henry's growing paranoia. He whispered of Anne's supposed infidelities, her sharp tongue, and her failure to produce a male heir, planting seeds of doubt in the king's mind that would soon grow into a deadly harvest. The accusations against Anne took shape with alarming speed. In late April 1536, Cromwell and his allies began to gather or fabricate evidence of her alleged crimes. They seized upon her interactions with courtiers, twisting innocent flirtations and courtly banter into evidence of adultery, a crime that carried the weight of treason when committed by a queen. Among the first to fall under suspicion was Mark Smeaton, a musician in Anne's household, who was arrested and, under duress, confessed to having been her lover. Whether this confession was coerced through torture or bribery remains a matter of historical debate, but it provided Cromwell with the spark he needed to ignite a full-scale investigation. Soon, other men in Anne's circle, including her own brother George Boleyn, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton, were implicated in a supposed conspiracy of infidelity and even incest, a charge so shocking it was almost certainly invented to inflame Henry's rage. On May 2, 1536, the trap snapped shut. Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace, taken by barge to the Tower of London under the stunned gazes of courtiers who had once bowed to her. The charges against her were staggering: adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother, and even plotting to kill the king, accusations that, if proven, would not only justify her execution but also annul her marriage and delegitimize her daughter Elizabeth. Anne, though shocked and defiant, could not have failed to grasp the gravity of her situation as she entered the Tower, the very fortress where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. Now, it was her prison, its cold stone walls a stark contrast to the silken chambers of her queenship. She was confined to the queen's lodgings, a bitter irony, and left to await a trial that many believed was a foregone conclusion. The emotional toll of her imprisonment was immense. Anne, known for her composure and quick wit, oscillated between despair and defiance, at times weeping for her daughter and her fate, at others protesting her innocence with a ferocity that unnerved her jailers. She was allowed few visitors, and those who did see her, including the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, reported her anguish over the accusations, particularly the charge of incest with her brother, which she vehemently denied. Letters and accounts from the time suggest Anne clung to the hope that Henry might relent, that their shared history and the daughter they had together might soften his heart. But Henry, consumed by a mix of wounded pride and political expediency, showed no mercy. He had already begun planning his marriage to Jane Seymour, and Anne's removal by any means necessary was the final step in erasing their past. As the days dragged on in the Tower, Anne's world shrank to the confines of her cell and the looming specter of her trial. The men accused alongside her were tried first, on May 12, and all but one were found guilty, their convictions serving as a grim prelude to her own fate. Anne's trial, held on May 15 in the Great Hall of the Tower, was a sham of justice, presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and a jury of peers handpicked for their hostility toward her. The evidence presented was flimsy, at best contradictory dates, coerced confessions, and salacious rumors, but in the charged atmosphere of the Tudor court, truth mattered less than the king's will. Anne defended herself with eloquence and courage, denying every charge, but the outcome was never in doubt. She was found guilty of high treason, and the sentence was death, either by burning or beheading, at the king's discretion. The speed of her fall was breathtaking. In mere weeks, Anne had gone from queen to condemned traitor, her name dragged through the mud, her legacy tainted by accusations that many, even at the time, doubted. Yet, as she awaited her execution, something remarkable emerged amidst her despair: a quiet resolve, a dignity that would define her final moments. What thoughts raced through her mind in those last days? What gave her the strength to face her end with such composure? The answers lie in the climactic moments to come, as we approach the day of her execution and the mystery of that haunting smile. In the dim, oppressive confines of the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn faced the harrowing reality of her impending death in the days following her trial on May 15, 1536. Found guilty of high treason through a litany of fabricated charges: adultery, incest, and plotting against the king, she was sentenced to die, the method left to Henry VIII's discretion. The once vibrant queen, who had danced through the courts of Europe and reshaped a nation through her marriage, now spent her final hours in a state of profound isolation, her world reduced to the cold stone of her cell and the relentless ticking of time. Yet, amidst the despair, Anne clung to a fragile thread of dignity, preparing herself for an end that would be as public as it was brutal. Her fate was sealed, but her spirit, remarkably, seemed unbroken. Henry, in a rare act of mercy, or perhaps a desire to avoid the spectacle of a burning chose beheading as the method of execution, and not by the crude axe typically used in England, but by a skilled swordsman summoned from Calais. This decision, while sparing Anne the prolonged agony of a botched execution, was cold comfort. The king, already planning his wedding to Jane Seymour, showed no sign of remorse or hesitation. Contemporary accounts suggest he was eager to erase Anne from his life entirely, even ordering that their marriage be declared null and void, rendering their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. Anne, informed of these developments, must have felt the sting of betrayal anew, yet she focused on readying herself for the inevitable. She spent much of her time in prayer, seeking solace in her faith, and reportedly expressed concern for her daughter's future, entrusting her care to those few still loyal to her memory. The night before her execution, Anne's emotions were a tempest of fear and resolve. She was visited by her confessor, and according to Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, she swore on the sacrament of her innocence, particularly regarding the charges of infidelity and incest. Her words carried a desperate sincerity, a final plea to history if not to her husband, whose heart had long since turned to stone. She also prepared small tokens and messages for her family, though many of these acts of farewell were stifled by the strict oversight of her jailers. Sleep, if it came at all, was fleeting, haunted by the knowledge that dawn would bring her final reckoning. Yet, as the hours slipped away, Anne seemed to gather an inner strength, a composure that would define her last moments and baffle those who witnessed them. On the morning of May 19, 1536, the day of her execution, the Tower of London buzzed with a grim anticipation. A small crowd of select nobles and officials gathered at Tower Green, a private space within the fortress chosen to limit public spectacle, though word of the Queen's fate had already spread like wildfire through London. Anne emerged from her lodgings, dressed in a simple gray damask gown lined with fur, her dark hair bound beneath a white linen coif, and a netted headdress a stark contrast to the opulent silks and jewels of her queenship. Her steps were steady, her face pale but composed, as she was escorted to the scaffold by Sir Kingston and a handful of guards. The crowd, though limited, included men who had once served her, now silent witnesses to her downfall, their expressions a mix of pity, fear, and cold indifference. As Anne ascended the scaffold, the weight of the moment pressed down on all present. She was given a moment to address the assembly, and her words, recorded by chroniclers like Edward Hall, were a masterclass in grace under unimaginable pressure. She did not rail against her fate or curse her accusers. Instead, she spoke with measured calm, praising Henry as a good, gentle, and sovereign lord, and urging those present to pray for him. She made no confession of guilt, a subtle but powerful act of defiance, instead asking for God's mercy on her soul and expressing hope that her death would be quick. Her speech, delivered with a clear voice despite the tremor of emotion beneath it, stunned the onlooker. She was a woman facing death with the poise of a queen, refusing to let her enemies strip her of her dignity in her final breath. Then came the moment that has echoed through history, the faint, enigmatic smile that played across Anne's lips as she knelt before the block. Chroniclers of the time, including those who witnessed the execution, noted this peculiar expression, a fleeting curve of her mouth just before she lowered her head. Was it a smile of resignation, a quiet acceptance of her fate, or was it something more, a final act of defiance, a silent message to Henry and her enemies that they could take her life but not her spirit? Some speculate it was relief, the end of months of torment and uncertainty, while others suggest it was a smirk of bitter irony, knowing the falsehoods that had condemned her. Whatever its meaning, that smile seared itself into the memory of those present, a haunting riddle that would puzzle historians for centuries to come. The executioner, a Frenchman renowned for his skill, approached with his sword concealed beneath a pile of straw to spare Anne the sight of it until the last possible moment. She removed her headdress, her dark hair spilling free for a moment before being tucked aside, and a blindfold was offered, though accounts differ on whether she accepted it. Kneeling, she murmured prayers, her voice steady even as her body tensed for the blow. The executioner, with a swift and merciful strike, ended her life in an instant, her head falling cleanly from her shoulders, blood pooling on the scaffold as a gasp rippled through the crowd. It was over in a heartbeat, a brutal punctuation to a life that had burned so brightly and fallen so far. Her body was quickly wrapped in a cloth and placed in an unmarked coffin, buried without ceremony in the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a final indignity for a woman who had once been England's queen. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd dispersed, some shaken, others hardened by the brutal realities of Tudor politics. Anne Boleyn, The woman who had captivated a king and changed the course of a nation was gone, her life snuffed out at the age of approximately 35. But her story did not end on that scaffold. Her death was merely the beginning of a legacy that would ripple through history, shaped by those who survived her and by the daughter who would one day rise to unimaginable heights. What became of those who orchestrated her fall? And what did that final smile truly mean in the grand tapestry of her tragic tale? The echo of the executioner's sword had barely faded on May 19, 1536, when the machinery of the Tudor court churned forward, as if Anne Boleyn's life and death were mere footnotes in the relentless pursuit of power. Her body, hastily interred in an unmarked grave beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Porty, Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London, received no royal honors, no grand funeral befitting a queen. The speed with which Henry VIII moved to erase her presence was staggering. Just 11 days after her execution on May 30, he married Jane Seymour in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The king, now in his mid-40s, seemed determined to bury the past, his once passionate love for Anne replaced by a calculated optimism for a new start and, hopefully, the male heir he so desperately craved. To the court and the kingdom, it was as if Anne had never existed, her name becoming a whispered taboo, her memory tainted by the scandal of her trial. For those who had orchestrated Anne's downfall, the immediate aftermath brought rewards, though not without lingering unease. Thomas Cromwell, the mastermind behind the fabricated charges, solidified his position as Henry's chief minister, his ruthless efficiency in removing the Queen earning him the king's favor for the moment. Cromwell's gamble had paid off. With Anne gone, he could steer the religious and political reforms of England without her interference, aligning himself with the more conservative factions that supported Jane Seymour. Yet, even as he basked in his triumph, Cromwell must have known the precariousness of his position in a court where loyalty was a fleeting currency. The same tactics he had used against Anne could one day be turned against him, a shadow that would loom larger in the years to come. Jane Seymour, now Queen, stepped into Anne's vacated role with a quiet determination to be everything her predecessor was not. Her meekness and deference to Henry were calculated to soothe his volatile temper, and her family, particularly her brothers Edward and Thomas, rose in prominence at court. Less than 18 months after her marriage, Jane delivered the long-awaited male heir, Edward VI, in October 1537, securing her place in Henry's affections and the Tudor dynasty. However, her triumph was short-lived. She died just 12 days later from childbirth complications, leaving Henry a widower once more. Though Jane was mourned by the king with a sincerity he never showed for Anne, her death left the court in flux again, a reminder of the fragility of life and favor in the Tudor world. For Anne's enemies, Jane's brief reign was a bittersweet victory, as the stability they sought remained elusive. Anne's family, the Boleyns, suffered a catastrophic fall from grace in the wake of her execution. Her brother George, convicted alongside her on the grotesque charge of incest, had been executed just 2 days before Anne on May 17, his death a brutal blow to the family's honor. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, and uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, survived the purge but were stripped of much of their influence, retreating from court to salvage what remained of their reputations. Thomas, once a favored diplomat, lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity, dying in 1539, haunted by the loss of 2 of his children to the king's wrath. The Boleyn name, once synonymous with ambition and ascent, became a cautionary tale of the dangers of rising too high too fast. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, faded into the background, her grief a private burden in a world that had moved on. Beyond the personal toll, Anne's death sent ripples through the political and religious landscape of England. Her execution, though intended to close a chapter, instead deepened the fractures caused by Henry's break with Rome. Many in Europe, Particularly Catholic powers like Spain and the Holy Roman Empire saw Anne's downfall as divine retribution for her role in the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though they mourned her less for her own sake than for the chaos her rise had unleashed. In England, her death did little to quell dissent. Reformers who had seen Anne as a champion of evangelical change were disheartened, while conservatives who opposed her felt emboldened, though wary of Henry's unpredictable whims. The king's marriage to Jane, a woman of more traditional piety, temporarily soothed tensions, but the religious schism Anne had helped ignite would continue to simmer, erupting into greater conflict in the decades that followed. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Anne's death lay in the fate of her daughter, Elizabeth. Declared illegitimate after the annulment of her parents' marriage, the young princess was just 2.5 years old when her mother was executed, too young to comprehend the loss but destined to bear its weight. Elizabeth was sidelined at court, her status diminished, raised in relative obscurity compared to her half-sister Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter. Yet, even in these early years, there were whispers of Anne's spirit in the child, her intelligence, her determination, traits that would one day define one of England's greatest monarchs. Though Anne could not have foreseen it, her bloodline would triumph through Elizabeth I, whose reign would reshape England into a global power, a bittersweet vindication of a mother erased from history by her enemies. The memory of Anne herself, however, was deliberately suppressed in the immediate aftermath. Henry ordered the destruction of many of her portraits and possessions, and her name was rarely spoken at court, as if to speak it might summon the ghost of a past he wished to forget. Chroniclers of the time, often writing under the influence of the crown or its factions, painted her as a schemer, a temptress, a woman whose ambition led to her deserved downfall. Yet, even in these biased accounts, there are hints of unease, of doubt about the justice of her trial, a recognition that her death was more about political expediency than truth. The mystery of her final smile, noted by those who witnessed her execution, became a quiet undercurrent in these narratives, a symbol of something unresolved, a question mark over the official story of her guilt. As we approach the conclusion of this tragic tale, we must reflect on how history has remembered or forgotten Anne Boleyn. Her life and death were a turning point, not just for the Tudor dynasty, but for the very soul of England. What lessons linger in the shadow of her scaffold, and how did that enigmatic smile come to define her story in ways even her enemies could not have anticipated? The story of Anne Boleyn, a woman who rose from the ranks of minor nobility to become the catalyst for one of the most tumultuous periods in English history, ends not with the fall of the executioner's sword on May 19, 1536, but with the enduring questions her life and death continued to provoke. Her execution on Tower Green was meant to be the final word, a brutal erasure of a queen who had dared to challenge the boundaries of power, love, and faith. Yet, history has a way of defying such finality. Anne's presence lingers, not just in the cold stone of her unmarked grave, but in the very fabric of England's past, woven into the reigns of her daughter Elizabeth I, and the religious and political upheavals that followed her time. Her enigmatic smile, captured in the fleeting moments before her death, remains a cipher, a symbol of defiance, resignation, or perhaps a secret known only to her, carried silently to the grave. Over the centuries, Anne Boleyn's image has been reshaped by historians, novelists, and dramatists, each generation casting her in a new light. In the immediate aftermath of her death, she was vilified by many as a schemer and a heretic, a narrative pushed by those loyal to Henry VIII, and later by Catholic chroniclers who saw her as the architect of England's schism with Rome. Yet, as time passed, particularly during the reign of her daughter Elizabeth I, who ascended to the throne in 1558, Anne's memory began to be rehabilitated, if quietly. Elizabeth, one of England's most celebrated monarchs, embodied her mother's intellect and tenacity, ruling for 45 years and leading England into a golden age of exploration and culture. Though Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne publicly, her very existence was a testament to her mother's impact, a living rebuttal to those who had sought to erase the Boleyn name. Through Elizabeth, Anne's bloodline triumphed, her legacy cemented in the annals of history even as her personal story remained shrouded in tragedy. The mystery of Anne's final smile has only deepened with time, becoming a focal point for speculation about her inner world in those last harrowing moments. Was it a gesture of bitter irony, a recognition of the absurdity of her fate at the hands of a man who had once moved heaven and earth to possess her? Or was it a moment of spiritual peace, a surrender to a higher power after months of torment and betrayal? Some historians suggest it might have been a message to her daughter, a silent promise that her spirit would endure despite the efforts to crush it. Others propose it was a smirk of defiance, a refusal to let her enemies see her broken, even as the sword loomed. We may never know the truth, but that ambiguity is part of what keeps Anne's story alive, a reminder that history is not just a record of events, but a tapestry of human emotions, often hidden beneath the surface of what is written. Anne's life also serves as a stark reflection on the precarious nature of power, particularly for women in a world dominated by men. She navigated the treacherous waters of the Tudor court with a brilliance that was both her greatest strength and her ultimate downfall. Her ambition, her refusal to be merely a mistress, and her sharp intellect made her a queen, but they also painted a target on her back in a society that often punished women for stepping beyond prescribed roles. Her story is a cautionary tale of the costs of ambition, but also a testament to the courage it takes to challenge the status quo. Anne did not just marry a king. She reshaped a nation, setting in motion the English Reformation, even if she did not live to see its full consequences. Her death was a tragedy, but her influence was indelible, a ripple that became a wave through the centuries. As we close this chapter on Anne Boleyn, we're left with a thought that lingers like a whisper in the halls of the Tower of London. What does her smile mean to us today? Is it a call to look deeper, to question the narratives handed down by victors, and to seek the humanity beneath the scandal? Her life, so full of passion and peril, invites us to reflect on the price of power, the fragility of love, and the strength it takes to face an unjust end with dignity. Perhaps that smile was her final gift to history, a puzzle that ensures we never stop asking who Anne Boleyn truly was, beyond the labels of queen, traitor, or victim. Her story is not just a relic of the past. It's a mirror to our own struggles with ambition, betrayal, and the search for meaning in a world that can be as cruel as it is captivating. If this tale has stirred something in you, as it has in me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think Anne's smile signified in those final moments? Do you see her as a victim of circumstance, a master of her own fate, or something in between? Drop your reflections in the comments below, or share any questions you have about her life and legacy. I'm eager to keep this conversation alive. And if you're as fascinated by the shadows of history as I am, consider exploring more stories of the Tudor court, where every triumph hides a tragedy, and every smile might conceal a secret.